Okay, we're gonna get started. Unfortunately, Clain was unable to join us in person, but we have him here via WebEx. As you can tell, in person, we have a pretty small group. So if you know someone who you think should be here, there's still room for them to join. So send them over. But tonight, why won't this go away? Tonight we have Clain Jones. I'm sure many of you already know him before. He's spoken for me for several things before. He's our MSU Extension Soil Specialist, and he'll be talking about, well, I asked him to talk about maintaining soil fertility without any fertilizer, and he, I'm sure, said some nasty things about me in reply to that email. So, Clain, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Adrian. That did remind me of your first email where you said, yeah, how to build soil health without using any fertilizer. And I changed that topic to fertilizer costs how much? Tips for using it efficiently. So I'm really thinking about all of you producers with the high cost of fertilizer. I know you've heard talks before about using fertilizer efficiently, but it becomes a lot more important this year to protect your bottom line and your dollars. So I really encourage you to challenge yourself to think about maybe one management practice that you could change to use less fertilizer or use the fertilizer that you buy more efficiently. And I'm going to give you some ideas how to do that. With the small group tonight, I hope you'll raise your hand if you have a question. Adrian can relay those questions to me. Or if you think of a question after the talk, feel free to give me a call at the number shown on your screen or send me an email at clainj@montana.edu. So my goal tonight is to present practices that increase fertilizer use efficiency, decrease losses, meaning keep more of those nutrients in your soil while increasing soil health. The concerns that a lot of people have that relate to both economics and the environment are decreasing leaching and runoff. Leaching is probably one of the top two causes of nutrient loss in Montana. Volatilization, meaning the loss of urea as ammonia to the atmosphere. That's probably the number one loss, I would guess. Denitrification to nitrogen gas. This happens under mainly saturated conditions, so we think it's less common in Montana. We know that high applications of nitrogen fertilizer can lead to soil acidity, and Pondera County, we think, has the second highest level of soil acidity in the state. And then most importantly to you this year would be the expense of fertilizer. But you do have a lot of management tools to increase fertilizer use efficiency and decrease fertilizer costs. Those include good soil testing, applying the right rate and source, the right timing and placement, what the industry calls the 4 R's, and then I like to call the 5 R's because crop rotation is so important to using fertilizer efficiently. And then finally, tools and technology have really, I think taken off a lot in the last 10 years. That technology can be everything from what I would call low tech, like just record keeping. So you know what happens on a field. What pesticides did you apply? What fertilizer did you apply? What was the protein? More high-tech tools like using imagery collected from drones or airplanes, and then things like online nitrogen calculators are all things that can help you use fertilizer more efficiently. So the first question I always get is, how much fertilizer do I need to apply? General concept that I think you all know is that fertilizer need equals the crop demand minus what's in the soil. Generally, we have a rough idea of what the crop demand is if you know what your yield goal is. What we don't know is what's in the soil if we don't test the soil. So you can decrease the fertilizer need by increasing the nutrient soil supply, how much nutrients are available in the soil. You can reduce losses, increase the fraction that's accessed by the crop through good timing and placement. You can plant legumes to fix nitrogen, increase soil organic matter to reduce losses and supply nitrogen. In general, if you have low soil organic matter, meaning less than about 1%, I recommend adding about another 15 to 20 units of N to make up for that low organic matter. If, on the other hand, you have greater than 3%, you can back off by about the same amount. And this would be probably a good year to consider backing off with high N costs. And then finally, you can reduce demand. So thinking about high demand crops, things like spring wheat, it needs a lot of nitrogen. You could consider growing, barley, maybe where you had spring wheat, growing a pulse crop that doesn't require any nitrogen. Maybe considering an oil seed. Oil seeds often require about the same pounds of nitrogen per bushel, but we almost never grow the same number of bushels, right? You might grow 40 bushels of spring wheat, but you'd be happy if you grew 20 bushels of canola. So again, what's in the soil? You need to soil test to determine what's in the soil. Traditionally, we've sampled for nitrate to about 2 feet or maybe even 3 feet. I recommend that this is done in the spring, and I'll show why on the next slide. We could be a lot more accurate with our nitrogen rate recommendations if we knew how much became available during the growing season. There are some tests that basically incubation tests where soil and water are mixed together, and over a 2-week period, we see how much nitrogen comes off. The problem is that mineralization, that breakdown of organic matter into nitrogen is so weather dependent. And as you know, weathermen can't really predict what's happening this Sunday, let alone what's going to happen over the growing season. Typically, I recommend soil testing for phosphorus and potassium to 6 inches, and timing is not quite as important as it is with nitrogen. So I mentioned that I prefer seeing spring soil testing. It's a much better estimate of what's going to be available during the growing season. The reason for that is if you produce a high nitrogen crop and that crop has a lot of residue with a lot of nitrogen in it, or you have a high soil organic matter content, and then you get a lot of mineralization, meaning decomposition over the winter, but you've based your N rates on that fall soil test, you've now over-fertilized because you weren't counting on all that nitrogen becoming available over winter. If instead you leave a lot of nitrogen after harvest on either, say, shallow or coarse soil, and then there's decent amounts of precipitation over winter and early spring, which we can only hope for, then you could end up under-fertilizing because you've lost nitrogen that you had counted on last fall. And I'm seeing a lot of high nitrate in Montana right now because of the 2021 drought, that the crop simply didn't remove the nitrogen that was available. Any questions so far?
I'm not seeing any, Clain.
Okay, thanks for checking. So now I'm going to talk about management practices to reduce nitrogen leaching. You might think of this as, simply an environmental concern, but the less nitrogen leaching that you have, the more nitrogen is in your soil for your next crop. So what are some factors to decrease N leaching? One would be picking the right rotation, picking rotations that don't require as much nitrogen and have some deep-rooted crops that can scavenge that deep nitrogen. Applying nitrogen based on a spring soil test, as I mentioned. Applying a conservative amount of nitrogen at planting. In Montana, we're very accustomed to putting on all of our nitrogen near the time of seeding. The problem with that is if you think you have, say, a yield potential of 50 bushels, and then we get a season like last year where there's just not moisture and you actually grow, say, 20 bushels, that's left a lot of costly nitrogen in your soil. So I really recommend backing off on that nitrogen around planting and then apply a second application later in the season if Mother Nature actually delivers. And that can be done with a broadcast application before the crop's too tall, using a washed out herbicide sprayer, or for those of you who own streamer bars, putting that nitrogen down between the rows. Definitely avoiding fall application on soils that can leach easily, and consider applying less nitrogen in areas that yield less or have shallow soils. You know, when nitrogen costs, say, 30 cents per pound, we didn't think that variable rate was that important, but now that it's at least twice that, it's really important not to put nitrogen down where your crop simply doesn't need it, say on a ridge top, or an area with shallow soils, or an area you're not sure why, but it never yields very well. Let's not put nitrogen in those areas. And then finally, using what's called an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, something that improves the efficiency of the fertilizer. I mentioned crop rotation. So one way to keep more of your nitrogen out of your groundwater and keep it in the soil or in your crop is to plant deep-rooted crops. This is some work out of Sydney, Montana that shows growing season from early May to mid-October and the groundwater nitrate concentration in parts per million. The EPA has determined that 10 parts per million is considered a safe rate to drink, and so I put that on there just to show what that level is. Small grains show that when nitrogen was tracked for 6 years under small grain fields, what the researcher found was that from mid-June to mid-July, that EPA drinking water standard was really flirted with. Sugar beet, which is also a shallow-rooted crop that I realize is not grown in Pondera County, also showed high nitrate levels, especially in spring. But safflower, which is a deep-rooted crop, had much lower nitrate levels in groundwater, suggesting more of that nitrogen was used by the crop because of those deep roots. What are some other deep-rooted crops you could consider? One would be sunflower, and then of course all perennials, alfalfa, sainfoin, grasses, all are deep-rooted and can help keep that nitrogen on your farm and out of your groundwater. We also know that continuous cropping or recropping leaves less nitrogen in the soil to leach. This is a work done in Swift Current, Saskatchewan, our neighbors to our north, that shows nitrate concentration in pounds of nitrogen per acre on the top and soil depth in feet down the bottom. This brown line here was fallow wheat. And so over a 37-year period, nitrate levels were, pretty low in the surface, but look at this big spike, somewhere around 8 feet deep. There was a lot of nitrate, 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre in this fallow wheat system. For those that were having fallow followed by wheat and then wheat, that's the gray dashed line. Notice there was a lot less nitrate at 8 feet. And then for those who are continuous cropping, that's shown in green dots, the nitrate levels were even less. We don't really have any crops in Montana that can suck up this 8-foot nitrate. So once it's this deep, it's probably not going to get back into your crop. In another study, this one in Culbertson, Montana, in northeast Montana, the researchers looked at a 20-year cropping system and measured how much nitrogen was lost over those 20 years with different tillage systems, different cropping systems. They measured that for no-till continuous wheat, spring-tilled continuous wheat, fall and spring-tilled continuous wheat, and then spring-tilled wheat fallow. What probably really stands out is how much nitrogen was lost from that spring-tilled wheat fallow, much higher than the spring-tilled continuous wheat. It's probably a mix of leaching losses, maybe some wind losses. And then the other interesting comparison here is the no-till continuous wheat lost relatively little nitrogen, whereas the twice-tilled continuous wheat lost twice as much nitrogen. And again, why might that be? The researchers didn't really know, but I would speculate that a lot of this was due to wind erosion, that twice tilling probably resulted in more erosion than no tilling. A little bit closer to home, a graduate student of mine named Andrew John studied the effects of replacing fallow with pea grown for grain on nitrate leaching. So here I plotted nitrate leached in pounds per acre on the y-axis for both 2013 and 2014. Pea grown for grain followed by winter wheat is shown in green. Fallow followed by winter wheat is shown in blue. Notice that in 2013, which is a pretty good moisture year in central Montana, about 30 pounds more nitrogen per acre leached after fallow than after that pea grown for grain, whereas there was really no difference in 2014. So you might think, well, why is that? Well, pea grown for grain doesn't require any nitrogen fertilizer. It uses water and it uses nitrogen before it starts fixing nitrogen. That's going to reduce the amount of leaching in the year after that pea crop is grown. Just west of Bozeman, a technician of mine, Terry Rick, did a study many years ago looking at mean nitrogen fertilizer recovery for 5 different crop rotations, ranging from really diverse, one with a cover crop, wheat, lentil, and a deep-rooted crop, safflower, all the way down to continuous wheat. And what she found was that nitrogen fertilizer recovered, so how much was recovered in the crop compared to how much was put down, was 65%. So about 2/3 of the nitrogen stayed in the crop with this diverse rotation over here on the left. Whereas only about 45% stayed in the crop for continuous wheat. And that's probably because of this cover crop, probably also because lentil didn't require nitrogen, and then also because safflower is so deep-rooted. Any questions on anything that I've covered so far this evening?
How did they make that determination, by soil sampling or by sampling the actual harvest?
So Clain, on that last graph, did you make the determination by soil sampling or sampling the actual plants?
This was the actual plant. So here we define nitrogen fertilizer recovery as just how much was removed by the crop compared to how much was put down. In some of our really longer term studies, we do look at nitrogen in the soil as well, and we add that to the fertilizer recovery, but it really doesn't change all of that much when we do that. Good question. Other questions?
Was there a test prior to putting down the fertilizer? See what the soil content was, and of course, then they put the fertilizer down. And then they know how much the plant absorbed, what was residual in the soil.
So was there a test, a soil test before to see what was in the soil already?
Yeah, so we did some of that work to look at like total nitrogen, soil organic nitrogen plus nitrate. We didn't see really big changes in this study looking across rotations. It seems that in longer term studies, like we're just wrapping up an 18-year study, then we do see some pretty big differences in soil. But in this particular study, we didn't see large differences in nitrogen in the soil.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we're good.
Sounds good. So I'm going to move on to practices that reduce nitrogen volatilization loss. So again, any ammonium-based fertilizer, including urea, can volatilize to the atmosphere, urea is probably the worst, followed by like 28 solution, and then things like ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate don't volatilize much at all. So I'm really going to focus on urea loss. My colleague Rick Engel, who has retired as of 2 years ago, has found that urea volatilization losses in Montana range anywhere from none, 0%, all the way up to 44% when urea is applied in either the fall or the winter as a surface broadcast. And what he found and what we found from other research is that there tends to be more loss when urea is applied to a moist soil or to a heavy dew. That starts the process of volatilization, but it's not wet enough to push that urea into the ground. It's worse when there's a lot of time between the application and incorporation of urea by, say, rainwater. The longer that urea sits on the ground, the longer it has to volatilize. High soil pH makes the problem worse, as does high soil temperature or frozen soil because the urea can't push down in. If there's a lot of crop residue, or say on a perennial field with a lot of thatch or residue, those urea granules can't make it down to the soil and stick to the soil, and therefore that can result in a lot of volatilization. Sandy soils don't hold ammonium to them very well, so that ammonium is out in solution where it can then volatilize to ammonia. Poorly buffered soils, again, low organic matter soils, low clay soils will also cause high volatilization losses. So take-home message there is the risk of loss increases the more of those high-risk conditions that you have. So just summing up that kind of busy slide is surface soil moisture at the time of fertilization is really important. It's better to apply on dry ground than wet ground. You really want precipitation as soon as possible. If it becomes more than about 2 weeks later, it has a lot of time to volatilize. So the worst case condition is probably a moist soil surface with only sprinkled for the next few weeks, because what that causes is that urea to dissolve, pH to increase right around the prill, and then urea to volatilize. This is a photo showing a time when Rick did a study using these things we called shuttles. He applied urea to a couple inches of snow somewhere over the next 6 days or so. About 9 pounds of nitrogen per acre was lost to the atmosphere. So that's a pretty big loss in just a few days. How much irrigation or how much rainfall do you need to essentially stop volatilization? I think that was answered really well by the study in Oregon that showed the effect of irrigation rate in inches on the percent of urea that was lost to the atmosphere. Notice when there was no irrigation applied after urea was applied, there was a really high loss of urea, 60%. We never saw that amount in Montana, but I think the overall concept is probably correct. Notice as irrigation starts increasing, volatilization drops off dramatically. And by the time we get to about 1/2 inch of irrigation or probably rainfall, only about 5% of the urea volatilized. And by the time we get to 1 inch, none of the urea volatilized. So I realize most of you probably are dryland farmers. You don't have the luxury of having irrigation, in which case you really need to encourage your crop advisor to apply before a rain event, somewhere probably 4/10 of an inch or more if you have confidence in your weatherman. This is a graph showing the effects of different fertilizers, urea, NBPT, which is what's called a urease inhibitor, which slows down this process of volatilization, and Super U, which also has this product called NBPT, which was historically in a product called Agrotane, it's now come off label. And so there's something like 12 different products that have NBPT in them that you can find on the market. Those 3 products were applied 3 different ways: surface broadcast, shallow placement, and then deep placement. Notice what they found was that when the urea was surface broadcast or applied really shallow, that canola seed yield increased dramatically with these enhanced products. Somewhere around 4 to 5 bushels per acre more was attained with these urease inhibitors, probably because they decreased volatilization dramatically, kept more of the nitrogen in the soil, more of it went into the canola. It's a little disturbing that even when that urea was down into the soils, it appears that a significant amount of it volatilized. It looks like you really need to get that urea down 2 to 4 inches deep. Now there's no advantage of these urease inhibitors. All of the products produced almost exactly the same canola yield. So the take-home message here would be, if you can apply your urea deep, go ahead and do it. Save money, don't buy these enhanced products. If you don't have a way to get those products deep, it might pay off to purchase one of these enhanced efficiency fertilizer products like NBPT. Any questions?
When would be the best time to apply those products?
So, you know, with canola, with a lot of our cereals, I think if you're going to put it into the ground, really you need to do it at the time of seeding, either, mid-row band or, near the seed, but not on top of the seed. If you're going to surface broadcast, you could do it, a little before seeding, right after seeding, with, again, oil seeds, with our wheat crops, our cereals. A lot of that nitrogen gets taken up pretty quickly, somewhere, between early and late tiller. And so you really don't want to wait more than, say, probably a few weeks after seeding. You might be able to wait a little longer if your soil nitrogen is high, but again, you'd have to soil test to know that's true. Anything else?
I don't think so. I think that's it.
Okay. So on to legumes, because they fix nitrogen, and therefore if you grow legumes, you don't have to apply any nitrogen, or maybe a reduced amount of nitrogen. So after a legume rotation, should you adjust your fertilizer up or down? The answer, of course, is down, because those legumes will leave a little bit of nitrogen in the soil. The big question is how much? How much can you reduce nitrogen fertilizer after a legume, or, in Montana's case, really a pulse crop? We estimate from work I've done with Perry Miller that if you grow a pulse crop like a pea, chickpea, or lentil 1 to 2 times in rotation with other crops, you can probably back off on your nitrogen by about 10 units. By the time you get a pulse crop in there, say 3 times over maybe a 9 or 10-year period, you can back off on your nitrogen by about 20 units. And you might be thinking, is that all those pulse crops contribute to the soil? And the answer is no, they actually contribute quite a bit more. But you have to think back to what is a nitrogen credit? What does it mean? So a nitrogen credit is how much fertilizer can you back off based on a standard soil test done in spring. So what those credits are really an estimate of how much nitrogen is getting released from that residue only during the growing season. So really only, May and June, early July. The nitrogen benefit of these pulse crops tends to be, 2 to 3 times this amount, because what they've done is they've usually used less nitrogen. They've put residue down in the ground, say in July or August, that then becomes available nitrogen before the next spring. So really, I see a much bigger benefit to pulse crops than simply this nitrogen credit. If instead you grow a cover crop, you can back off even more, 20 to 30 units after 1 to 2 times, maybe 30 to 50 units after 3 times. And then perennial legumes like alfalfa and sainfoin have a really wide range of N credits because it really depends on how healthy are those crops, how much of weeds and grass come in and maybe decrease the amount of N fixation. But we can see some pretty large N credits after a long-term alfalfa rotation is taken out of production. One thing I'd encourage you to do, not just if you're growing legumes, but if you're growing any wheat crops, is to really track your protein by field. Work again done by my colleague Rick Engel has shown very conclusively that if your spring wheat consistently has more than about 13% protein, you're probably sufficient in your nitrogen. If you have substantially less than that, you're probably losing yield. If you have substantially more than that, you might be applying more nitrogen than you need. For winter wheat, that critical level is around 12.5%. So again, if you have consistently get proteins in winter wheat above 12.5, probably are doing okay. Less than 12.5, you maybe need a little more nitrogen. The reason I have this on a pulse slide is I'm encouraging you to, to take your nitrogen credit if your protein is consistently high. If it's not, you might not want to take that nitrogen credit because you probably want to get a little bit higher protein, and therefore don't back off on your nitrogen fertilizer. We know legumes add a lot of what's called potentially mineralizable nitrogen. Work done out of Bozeman, Montana, just west of here, tracked potentially mineralizable nitrogen in pounds of nitrogen per acre in the top 6 inches for a fallow wheat system, a continuous wheat system, a pea green manure wheat system, and then a pea grown for grain followed by wheat. And what they found was that there was about 30 pounds of nitrogen more per acre in the soil for those growing a pea green manure, meaning a pea cover crop, than continuous wheat or fallow wheat, and the pea grown for grain was intermediate. So that's a lot of nitrogen, and that's a lot of dollars at today's fertilizer costs. Another way to add nitrogen to a soil would be adding alfalfa to a forage mix. This is work done out of Alberta in a fairly wet area, 17.5 inches average annual precip, showing the effects of annual nitrogen added in fertilizer ranging from 0 to 100 on dry matter yield in tons per acre. Notice for a system that's 100% grass, that to maximize yield, it looks like they needed more than about 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So it's very expensive to fertilize a highly productive grass field. Whereas straight alfalfa really had, its highest yield at a very low nitrogen rate, and it didn't really benefit the yield to grow anymore. The other point is the alfalfa grass mix, something that had 1/3 to 2/3 alfalfa with the rest grass, always out yielded the straight grass and the straight alfalfa. And you could grow a really respectable amount of tonnage with very little nitrogen with that alfalfa grass mix. So just some points about nitrogen from legumes. Legume cover crops release more N more quickly than a grain crop, a grain pulse crop. The nitrogen benefit, of course, depends on the legume species, how long it's grown, how often it's grown, and then weather conditions. Legumes should probably be at least 50% of a cover crop if you want to provide substantial amounts of plant available nitrogen to your next crop. And that's shown here in this graph from some work in Oregon where they grew a 100% legume crop a 75% legume with the rest being a cereal, a cover crop that was 25% legume, and then a cover crop that was 100% cereal. Then they track plant available nitrogen from that cover crop. So anything above this line had a positive contribution. Anything below this line depleted the nitrogen. So by growing 100% legume or 75% legume, they contributed a lot of plant available nitrogen. Whereas when they only had 25% legume in the crop and they terminated it late in the season, they really didn't gain anything. And then a cereal cover crop actually loses nitrogen. Microbes use up the nitrogen in decomposing that grass or that cereal. What about profitability? I've been talking a lot about soil and leaching and losses. Take-home message though is, what rotations are the most profitable in your region? This is work done out of Big Sandy, looking at the 8-year net return in dollars per acre for a chem fallow system, a cover crop system that was cut for hay in its last year, a legume grain system. So this was chickpea 1 year, lentil 1 year, and pea 1 year, and then a continuous wheat system. And that net return or profit was calculated for 2 different protein discounts, what the researchers called flat or low discount, or steep or high discount. And notice that regardless of discount, the system that was a legume grain followed by a wheat produced much more profit than the chem fallow system, the cover crop system, which was really poor, or the continuous wheat system. So not only are these legumes good for putting nitrogen in the soil, reducing leaching, probably reducing volatilization, it looks like they can also increase profit. Any questions so far?
We do have one in the chat. What cover
Okay.
crop would give you the best nitrogen credit? Radish, turnips, or some legume?
It would definitely be legume, and there's a lot of work out there on radish that shows that there's decent levels of nitrogen after a radish crop is grown, especially in the Midwest. But the problem is that radish didn't make any of its own nitrogen. So all of that nitrogen had to come from the soil and then was recycled. So really it's a legume that's making its own nitrogen, probably fixing somewhere on the order of 50 to 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre based on research I've done in Montana. And so all of that nitrogen ends up back in the soil, and then a certain fraction of that ends up available to that next crop during the growing season. So I would say definitely a legume. Anything else?
Okay, so on the graph where you have lentils and wheat, leg grain, and then wheat, is that a spring wheat or a winter wheat?
This was all winter wheat.
Okay, and what was the other part?
Yep. So the only difference was continuous wheat would have been spring wheat, spring wheat, winter wheat. This pulse grain crop, say lentil, would have been lentil, then winter wheat, then say pea, winter wheat, chickpea, winter wheat.
So how big of a hit was it taking yield-wise, the wheat?
This was from memory. I don't have that graph, but somewhere, on the order of probably, because it used more water than chem fallow, maybe 5 or 7 bushels per acre. But then there was revenue attained. So even though there was a loss of wheat revenue, there was a gain in that fallow year. And so that's why this is substantially higher than the chem fallow.
So was that using the nitrogen credits, so you were taking the 10 pounds off each time?
Yep, we try to use what we recommend. So I think in each year we would have been backing off about 10 pounds in per acre. So, that would have that end credit wouldn't have affected this profit very much. That might be, say, $5. The big reason this is so large really is because there was revenue in that pulse year. And there was no revenue, there was only cost in that chem fallow year, spraying cost.
Okay, then going back to the cover crops, can the radish pull some of that deep nitrogen back up to a level a small grain could utilize it?
Yeah, definitely. We grew radishes in our cover crop studies, and we tried to grow some deep-rooted crops to see if they would either break up compacted layers or bring more nitrogen up towards the surface. They might do that a little better than legumes. Legumes are some of the more shallow-rooted crops, but we were also terminating these cover crops pretty early, like around first flower for pea. So none of the crops got super deep in that time. So probably if you really want to capture deep nitrogen, you need to grow a crop probably about all the way, to seed, and something like a safflower, something that's really rooted pretty deeply. Great questions, you guys. Michael asked.
We got
I can
another
only
one.
see it. Yeah, I saw one from Michael. It came and went.
So we have one in person.
What prices were used to determine pea and wheat revenue? Is that the question you wanted me to answer?
Yeah, go for that one.
Yeah, so Michael, I think those estimates or those dollar amounts are probably likely in our fertilizer fact sheet that we produced on that particular study in Big Sandy, or Perry or I could get those to you, but they were definitely, in that study ended about 3 years ago. So they were in a period when pulse crops had higher revenue than they did, say, 2 years ago.
Okay, I think that's all.
Okay. So on to a little bit on fertilizer rates. So this is on that exact same study, looking at 8-year net returns, but just graphed in a different way. So what I'm showing here is nitrogen rate in pounds per bushel. So our standard rate in that study was 3 pounds of N per bushel, which a lot of Montana, producers apply somewhere around there. And so what we saw was when we applied low rates of nitrogen, essentially none, that was our poorest revenue nitrogen rate. When we applied somewhere around 2.25, we had a little bit higher. 3 pounds turned out to be about our highest revenue, regardless of whether we had high protein discounts or low protein discounts. And then if the protein discounts were high, it actually paid to apply a little bit more. If they were low, then there was a big drop in net return. However, I wouldn't encourage this 4-pound N per bushel rate, especially in that Big Sandy area, because what we saw was as we applied more nitrogen over that 8-year study, soil pH really dropped pretty dramatically. So this was a site that had pHs in the mid-6s when we started this study. 8 years later, at the high nitrogen rate, we dropped that pH all the way down to about 5.6. So legumes have trouble fixing nitrogen below about 5.8, and we start seeing toxicity somewhere around 5.2. And so even though, we saw some decent revenues out here at these really high rates, those were also associated with the rates that dropped the pH the most. So I really think there's this sweet spot somewhere between, 2 and 3 pounds N per acre where we have decent net returns and we haven't dropped the pH dramatically. So kind of a sum up slide, more is not better. There's this concept called law of diminishing returns, that when we apply nitrogen, when there's not much nitrogen around, Our crop yield tends to go up pretty steeply, but then at some point it starts plateauing. So the greatest yield increase per pound added is when N rates are low. Additional N at some point does not produce any yield and will leach and will acidify. So finding where that sweet spot is something I've been trying to do here at MSU. One way to calculate N rates that I think is good for your bottom line with high fertilizer prices and also good for your soil and your water is to come up with realistic yield goals. The research centers have some great variety selection tools. Kent McVeigh out of the Southern Ag Research Center has developed one where you can go to your area and determine what varieties work best for your area and what yields can you expect for your area. And then again, if you have some ability to apply nitrogen in season with streamer bars, with a sprayer, that does allow you to be a little more conservative around the time of seeding and then only apply nitrogen if there's sufficient rainfall. So how do you determine the nitrogen rate to optimize your profit? One way to do that is use MSU's N economic calculator. You'll need to know a few things before you use that calculator, like N fertilizer cost, grain price, which you may or may not know right now, whether you've locked in a grain price or not, protein discount and premiums. I think that's really about the hardest to estimate right now what things are going to be in July and August. Your yield goal, you probably know. Soil nitrate N from a soil test, you would know right now if your crop advisor sampled in fall. You'll know in April if they sample this spring. And then soil organic matter. So that's 7 items. If you know those 7 items, you can then use MSU's fertilizer calculator. We have 3 different calculators online. One is for barley, one is for spring wheat, and one is for winter wheat. And they were all developed based on MSU fertility trials done over the last about 3 decades after fallow. So not as helpful for those of you who are recropping, but for those of you fallow, they hopefully can help you pick an N rate. Another tool to use is Kent McVeigh has put all of my fertilizer guidelines that are in a hard copy book into an electronic form where you type in your Olsen phosphorus, your potassium, your soil organic matter, what your crop is going to be, what your yield goal is going to be, and it spits out what your fertilizer recommendation is. So again, in optimizing your fertilizer N rate, I hear things like, I don't want to leave any yield on the table. If it's a good year, I want to make sure I have a lot of nitrogen out there, but there are dangers of that approach. For example, if it's hot and dry again in 2022, if there's low protein discounts, you're going to end up with probably lower net returns and risk losing that nitrogen to the environment. In a wet year, if you apply a lot of nitrogen early, you can get excess tiller production. If you're irrigating, you probably want those tillers. Those tillers have a good chance of producing grain, but if you're in a dry land situation, you've probably seen you get a lot of growth and those tillers don't produce grain except in the really wettest of years. You also have a risk of high forage nitrates, which I heard a lot about in 2021. You can get lodging and, again, soil acidification. So soil acidification, is this maybe a reason to adjust your nitrogen rates? Soil acidification is caused by high rates of ammonium-based fertilizer, and we end up seeing a lot of crop failure in Choteau County and some in Pondera County. This is an example of this is a durum field where this area where the crop looks really crappy. Those are all low pH soils, And then in the background in that same field, there's some really great looking crops as well. How fast does pH drop? We have found in just west of Bozeman that the pH drops by about 0.04 pH units for every 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied. It might not sound that much, but think over 10, 20, 30 years, that becomes 1 or 2 pH units, and that's enough to really hurt legume nodulation and cause aluminum toxicity. This would be a hard question for, say, an ag economist, but should we start considering the cost of lime and calculating the N rate? If you put on enough nitrogen to maximize profit in this year, you maybe are setting yourself up for having to lime with pretty expensive haul costs for lime. I've looked at rates up to 4 tons per acre at, say, $35 per ton to haul that to the triangle. You're starting to look at $140 per acre, so really expensive. Farmers tell me you do not want this problem, those that currently have it. Variable rate applying nitrogen. Most fields in Montana kind of look crazy like this, where you have very different amounts of nitrogen over a field. So might as well apply a little bit more where you yield a lot and a little bit less where you don't yield as much. And you might think of this as a really high-tech approach, but sometimes we find fields where, parts just don't yield as well. And you could maybe, with your current equipment, just put on a little bit less nitrogen in those areas. If you want to do some on-farm experimentation with some MSU researchers, Bruce Maxwell is really ramping up his program on-farm variable rate. You can write him at bmax@montana.edu and maybe become one of his farmer collaborators. Any questions on any of that?
It's not looking like it.
Okay, sounds good. So now on to phosphorus and potassium. This is a graphic showing how your phosphorus soil test, ranging from very low to medium to high to very high, affects the importance of broadcasting in black versus banding in red on yield. So what it shows is that if you have reasonable levels of phosphorus, there's probably not huge advantages of banding over broadcast. But as soon as you get kind of medium, low, or very low, so your crop is really phosphorus deficient, now there's going to be big advantages of subsurface banding your phosphorus, getting it near the seed, which I'm guessing probably most of you already do. You do have to be a little cautious about how much phosphorus you put down with the seed. Some work out of Alberta where they were tracking pea seed yield based on how much phosphorus was put down with the seed. They found that when they side banded, so here there wouldn't be any germination problem because the phosphorus would be far enough from the seed. They got really nice yields, really high yields, 50, 60 bushels per acre. However, when they seed placed that phosphorus at these high rates, they really lost a fair amount of yield, 4 or 5 bushels per acre. That was on a loam. On a clay loam, finer textured soils, we don't see as much damage from fertilizer in the seed row. So here, the sideband and seed placed yields are actually a lot more similar, but there still looked like was some damage from that seed placed phosphorus. Most guys I talk to, are applying somewhere between maybe 10 and 25 pounds of P2O5 per acre. So you're in a range where you're probably not seeing a very, big stand reduction from that extra phosphorus. So that's some general take-home messages. We see less issues in our clay soils, high soil organic matter soils, and higher moisture soils when we put a lot of fertilizer down in furrow. I'm going to skip questions and move on to timing. Timing, of course, really depends on source. So there's these readily available fertilizers like urea, 28 solution, 1152. Yeah,
We have a couple of questions about the last section.
sure. What
Do you
is
have
considered
something
medium?
similar like this one for wheat?
You know, I've seen work, and I haven't reported on it for a while, older work in Montana on barley, and I think it would be pretty similar. You know, the oil seeds, like canola, are probably the most sensitive. Pulse crops a little less sensitive, and then cereals probably less sensitive still. So I would think that we'd see somewhat similar results, but probably a little shrinkage here between sideband and seed placed. And I consider an Olsen phosphorus level somewhere around 8 parts per million to be a medium soil testing. And so answer Michael's question on the chat.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. Was that it?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. All right. So yeah, these fast available sources, you know, really can be put on probably up to mid-tillering and still will get taken up by the crop. Phosphorus and potassium really need to be put down near the time of seeding because they're so immobile. You really need to get them down into the root zone. These slowly available sources, like say slow release nitrogen, manure, elemental sulfur, they take time to become available. So they really need to be put on probably the previous year to be available during the present growing season. When we think about nitrogen uptake specifically, because this is something that we can put down mid-season, I like to look at the effects of plant growth stages on cumulative nitrogen uptake. And what we see in kind of a general sense is a typical S-shaped curve where nitrogen uptake is really low during, say, the early leaf stage, really high during tillering into early stem elongation, and then essentially plateaus by early to mid heading, where the plant looks like it's still growing, but it's really putting all of its energy and all of its nitrogen into the grain, and it's not really taking up much more. If you want to maximize yield, you really need to get that nitrogen on by, you know, mid to late tillering at the latest. If instead you're trying to bump protein, you need to get it on a little later. It essentially will go into yield and it won't go into protein. So stem elongation to early heading is the best time to get your nitrogen into your protein. Phosphorus, again, is really immobile. And so a pop-up, meaning a starter fertilizer, getting a little phosphorus down with the seed can really improve, get that crop out of the ground quickly and get it growing quickly. So this is a photo showing just 10 pounds of starter P2O5 per acre with the seed compared to no starter phosphorus on the right. And interestingly to me, a pretty big fertilizer application was done the previous fall, banded with 30 pounds of P2O5 per acre. So it's a little surprising, but there was a dramatic effect of that starter phosphorus on the stand. So just to sum up, a combination of management changes is likely needed to substantially increase fertilizer use efficiency. I've told you a number of specific ones, each of which might improve the fertilizer use efficiency a little, but added together, it can increase the efficiency of fertilizer use a lot. Base rates of fertilizer application on your soil test and crop needs. Really manage nitrogen with that whole nitrogen cycle in mind. So thinking about losses, you know, you don't want losses to the atmosphere. You don't want losses to your groundwater. You want to keep that nitrogen in the soil, which protects your pocketbook. Make sure to select placement and timing for optimal plant uptake, and keep in mind that each growing region and probably each farm and each field might have unique best management practices to increase nutrient use efficiency. And because we can't really test all possible conditions, I've given you some general recommendations. I really recommend doing strip trials. So like if you're interested in, say, a new product that you've heard works great, try it on, one seed pass. Flag it, maybe use your yield monitor, see if it actually works. Maybe you've been taking, say, your crop advisors, fertilizer rate recommendations, or MSUs for years. Maybe try backing off a little bit, again, in a strip, seeing maybe you'll get the same yield, maybe you'll get similar protein. These are just some things you can try on your own farm to make sure those recommendations work for you. If you do have any other questions or want more information, you can go to my website at landresources.montana.edu/soil fertility, or again, like I mentioned, give me a call. And with that, any questions that you didn't get answered so far?
Nothing in person.
I do see a question in the chat from, is there a difference between how plants take up synthetic N versus natural N in the soil? So that was just a private chat to me. Synthetic nitrogen is something like urea, which gets converted over to ammonium. When soil organic matter, or say P residue, breaks down, its first product is ammonium. And so those are chemicals that are identical. There is no difference between them. Then that ammonium gets converted over to nitrate. They're the same whether they came from the soil, plant residue, or fertilizer. So no, there's no difference in how plants take up the two. Anything else, Adrian?
I have no other questions in person here.
All right. Well, that was great. I've given talks to much larger audiences this fall, like to South Dakota, and for whatever reason, they were quiet. And I think maybe the bigger the audience, sometimes the fewer questions. So I really appreciated all your great questions, and feel free to ask them by email or phone anytime.
Awesome. Thank you, Clain.
Yep. Take care, you guys.
Okay. For those of you joining online, thanks for joining us. And thank you for joining in person too. All right, thanks, Clain.